Thank you all for being here. I know some of you, and some of you I don't know, so hello to everyone, whether I know you or not. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I am from Boston. I am the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR, which is based in or near Boston. And we're very happy to be a co-sponsor of tonight's program, as well as a number of other programs that Kachi has so industriously worked to organize and hold here at Columbia University. We're very happy that there's so much activity here at Columbia in the Armenian realm, and to be part of it. So our speaker tonight is George Bournoutian, and I have a official introduction and a slight personal introduction. So Professor Bournoutian has taught in Eastern European and Middle Eastern history at Iona College since 1989. He's taught Armenian and Iranian history at UCLA and at Columbia University also. Moreover, in past years, he organized and taught the first Armenian history courses at the University of Connecticut, Glendale Community College, New York University, Ramapo College, Rutgers University, and Tufts University, which is where I first bumped into him many years ago now. Professor Bournoutian is also the author, translator, or editor, and compiler of more than 30 volumes, including annotated translations of primary sources in Armenian, Russian, and Persian, with introductions, glossaries, and indexes, to say nothing of numerous book chapters and articles. And the most recent of his publications we're going to hear about tonight is Armenia and Imperial Decline, the Yerevan Province, 1900 to 1914, which was just published by Routledge. And if you are interested in purchasing a copy, this is not the book. It's actually thicker than this. But this will allow you to order the book. This work of Bournoutian's continues the project that I think runs through much of his work, making available in English important primary source materials pertaining mostly to Eastern Armenia under Persian and Russian imperial rule. Thanks to his publications, which includes, but is definitely not limited to, the following: Eastern Armenia in the last decades of Persian rule, the Khanate of Yerevan under Qajar rule, Russia and the Armenians of Transcaucasia, a documentary record, Armenians and Russia, a documentary record, 2 chronicles on the history of Karabakh, the 1823 Russian survey of the Karabakh province, the 1829 to 32 Russian surveys of the Khanate of Nakhichevan, the Russian survey of the Khanate of Shirvan. You get the general idea. And now Armenia and Imperial Decline. Bournoutian has given English language readers the most complete available picture of Eastern Armenia in the last century and more of imperial rule up to the time of the formation of the Armenian Republic in 1918. And what he's provided is an immense service to scholars and to readers all over the world. I first met George around 1992 when I was a graduate student and he was a visiting professor at Tufts University, and I sat in on the Armenian history class he was teaching. He was very funny, very entertaining, and took great pleasure in deflating all of the myths and illusions that the students in the class had. I remember in the first class, practically the first words out of his mouth were, "I know you all think you know something about Armenian history. You've heard stories in church school and Sunday school and whatever. This isn't going to be like that. This is going to be real history." And everybody sort of looked at each other and went, "Oh, okay, well, we're in for it." It's been my privilege in the 20 years that I've been at NAASR to introduce him on many occasions, although this is the furthest I've ever driven for the privilege. And the connection runs deeper than that because NAASR and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies, which NAASR administers, have provided support for several of George's great publications, including his new one, Armenia and Imperial Decline. And the George and Ani Bournoutian collection of more than 5,000 books is one of the cornerstones of NAASR's Mardigian Library, for which we are truly grateful and fortunate. So I can't be happier to be here, and I'm embarrassing George, but that's where I'll stop. George Bournoutian, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. It really is a pleasure to be invited by Dr. Muradian, the Armenian Club, NAASR. It's the first time I'm lecturing to so many young people. You have no idea how happy I am. Usually when I lecture to Armenian communities, it's the octogenarians who come sit, and after the lecture, they have no questions. They have new declamations. They don't listen to the lecture. They've come there to vent something. So, I know this is not going to be one of those. The lecture today really is the foundation of present-day Armenian state. Most of it during this period. Just as an introduction, I am sure you're all aware, since you're all Armenian students, of the fact that the last already fragmented Armenian kingdom in historical Armenia ended in 1064. By the 15th century, the Turkish, Mongol, and Turkmen invaders and settlers and the immigration of Armenians had changed the ethnic composition of historical Armenia, and the Armenians had become a minority in their homeland. Meanwhile, jumping somewhere else, the kingdom of Cilician or Cilician Armenia, which was formed at the end of the 12th century with the help of the Crusaders, outside the territory of historical Armenia, began to decline 50 years later. And after the departure of the Crusaders, faced the same fate as the Armenian highlands. Left with no political or military leaders, Armenians relied on their church and on the writings and copyings of manuscripts of their historians, most of them churchmen, to keep their heritage alive. Throughout the 16th and the first third of the 17th century, the land of Armenia became a battleground between the new Iranian state, or the Persian state, under the Shia Safavids, and the Sunni Ottoman Empire. This is all you know. This is just introduction. In 1604, Shah Abbas of Iran forcibly deported hundreds of thousands of Armenians from the Yerevan Nakhchivan region. Without this, forget the A that was added, B and the rest, to Iran. In 1639, some years later, Iran and the Ottoman Empire agreed to partition historical Armenia into the Persian and Turkish sectors. European and later Armenian historians refer to these sectors as Western or Turkish Armenia, Arevmetian Hayastan, and Eastern or Persian Armenia, Arevelian Hayastan. No such designations appear in the Muslim sources. Just let's be clear. If you're looking at the Muslim sources, there's no such thing as Turkish Armenia or Iranian Armenia. This is something that was done by Europeans and Armenians. And this division became so important and so long-lasting because there was a burnt territory between the two that Armenians ended up speaking after that two dialects. That's why some of you speak Western Armenian and some of you speak Eastern Armenian. Okay? And everybody says mine is better, which is very idiotic because they're dialects. Of course, it's very difficult when Gagik becomes Kakik. That's a problem. So, this becomes a little bit of a problem. So, it is interesting to note, however, that the border between the new Muslim states is relatively close to the present-day border between Armenian Republic, Iran, and Turkey. The border of 1639, very close. By the mid-18th century, the Persian rulers had divided Persian Armenia or Eastern Armenia into two khanates, governorships. Khanate of Yerevan and Khanate of Nakhchivan. Forget about A, that's a later addition. Khanate of Yerevan, including Mount Ararat and Surmalu, and F and G is Khanate of Nakhchivan. Small clusters, however, of Armenian villages were located in the Khanates of Qarabakh, in Shushi, Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, Lernayin Qarabakh, whichever you like it, Ganje, and Akhalkalaki in Georgia, today Javakh. You've heard of Javakh. So, these were outside this territory. They were either in Georgia or in the Khanate of Qarabakh, etc. At the start of the 19th century, Russia, which had become a major power in the 18th century under Peter the Great, annexed Georgia and planned to seize the entire territory between the Caspian and the Black Seas. This led to the First Russo-Persian War, 1804-1813, by which Russia annexed the present-day territory of Azerbaijan, which included Shushi. Okay, you understand the problem we're having here. And referred to it as the Muslim or Caspian province. It was only after the Second Russo-Iranian War, 1826-28, that Russia conquered Yerevan and Nakhchivan. Following this second war, Russia, in order to reward the Armenians for their pro-Russian stance, it's in my other books, Armenian volunteers joined the Russians, fought the Persians, Armenian units led by all sorts of, this is not the lecture here, rewarding for their pro-Russian activities during the wars, as well as to create a buffer zone between Iran and the Russian headquarters in Tiflis, Georgia, up there, combined the regions of Yerevan and Nakhchivan into a new Russian Armenian province. The word is Armyanskaya Oblast, Haykakan Mars. Okay? Artsakh and Javakh remained outside of this Armenian province. The first was in Georgia, the second was in the Elizabethpol province. Russians changed Qarabakh province and Ganja into Elizabethpol province. Thus, after some 800 years, the term Armenia in quotes, with defined borders, appeared on an official state map, albeit not as an independent state, but as a part of the Russian Empire. But the word Armenia appeared in all the Russian maps. Realizing that this Armenian population, after 8 centuries of wars, invasions, immigrations, had been reduced to a minority in this new Armyanskaya Oblast, the Armenian province, the Russians conducted the surveys and realized there's only 25%. The rest, 75%, were Kurds, Turks, Muslims, and all sorts of other groups. Assyrians. Armenians were only 25% of this new province. Realizing this is a problem, Russian and Armenian leaders included Article 15 in the peace treaty of Turkmenchai with Iran, the peace treaty of 1828. It allowed 1 year for all Persian Armenians whose ancestors had been driven to Iran by Shah Abbas 200 years before, 1 year to repatriate, nergacht, the Armenian word, repatriate to this new Russian Armenian with all their belongings, cows, donkeys, whatever they could carry. And they had 5 years' time to sell their properties and bring the money over. By 1832, Armenians achieved a parity. That is, 50% of this Russian Armenia was Armenian, 50% was Muslim. This Armenian province, during the first 20 years of Russian rule, was treated as a colony. But in 1849, the new viceroy, Prince Michael Vorontsov, who saw the Armenians as a force to improve the economy of the region, already they were inviting the Armenians to come to Tiflis and other places for business. They realized Armenians are doing very well for the economy, enlarged the Armenian province by adding the Alexandropol, Gyumri. This is Gyumri. This is Alexandropol province. that used to belong to Georgia. In 1849, he took this and added it to the Armenian province, the area A, and he renamed the whole area the Yerevan gubernia, or Yerevan province. From that date until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Yerevan province was the only region in the Caucasus, as well as the entire Russian and Ottoman empires, where the Armenians formed the majority of the population. According to the first all-Russian census, the only official one, 1897, Armenians accounted for 53% of the population of the Yerevan province. Now you say, well, 53% is not a lot. By 1914, when the book ends and the last statistical before World War I and the genocide, the Armenians formed 60%. Now, the main reason for such a small growth was the immigration of Armenians to the larger commercial centers. Tiflis, Baku, Moscow, Nornakhchevan, etc., etc. Plus, the Muslim Turks and Kurds had multiple wives and hence more children. Very simple. But it's deceiving. I say 60%, you say, well, it's not a lot, but be careful. The Armenians were the majority of these areas. Alexandropol, Echmiadzin, Yerevan, Novobayazid, and Daranagiris. Armenians were a minority in Surmalu, which included Mount Ararat, Sharur, and Nakhchevan. So if you remove those, Armenians were almost 78% of the population, not 60%. But overall, they were 60%. Okay? One has to remember that the Yerevan province was one of the less significant provinces of the South Caucasus. It did not have the political or economic stature of Tiflis, Kutaisi, Elizabethpol, and Baku provinces. Many Armenian doctors, businessmen, authors, lawyers, and almost all of its future political leaders preferred to live in the above cosmopolitan industrial and commercial areas, and not in the largely peasant Yerevan province. In fact, most of these leaders were not born, had never lived, or had visited the province or the city of Yerevan. This will have a problem later on. It is not surprising, therefore, that almost all pre-revolutionary Russian studies, books, written in Russian and printed in Tiflis, focused on the overall social economic conditions of the entire Caucasus and on the Tiflis province, the center of the Russian administration of the Caucasus, and not on the Yerevan province. After Sovietization, Soviet historians, both Armenian and non-Armenian, focused mainly on the changes that occurred after 1921. They viewed pre-revolutionary Armenia, with a great deal of justification, one may add, as a backward agricultural region, which had only blossomed into an urbanized, industrialized, progressive, in quote, society under communism. They downplayed the history of the First Republic. They vilified the ARF, which had been the largest and most active Armenian political party and had remained so in the diaspora. The majority of the historians of Armenia in the United States and Europe either concentrated on the classical and medieval periods, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Garsoyan, I can go on and on, could not read Russian, focused their efforts on the Armenian literary and revolutionary movements in Turkey, Georgia, and Russia, or in the case of one historian, you know who, concentrated on the political history of the First Armenian Republic. Okay? In fact, almost all the scholars who have studied the history of the Caucasus in modern times have ignored the social and economic achievements accomplished by the Armenians of Russian Armenia, 70-year rule. They have completely ignored the Armenian province, which after all, and the Yerevan province, which after all formed the core of the First Armenian Republic, later Soviet Armenia, and today present-day Armenia. This is it. That's all we have. I mean, I know you're talking about Kars, all that. That was 800 years ago. I mean, I wish we had all of this. But realistically, this is what it was for 90 years, from 1828 until 1917, 1918. And after Sovietization, the First Republic, that's all we ended up having, with some additions and some minuses. We'll get to that. I was well aware of the fact that after the industrialization efforts and administrative reforms undertaken by Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin in the late period of the Russian Empire, the local Russian administration of the Yerevan province must have left some records, although in Russian probably, on the socio-economic conditions of the province. After all, the opening of the Tiflis-Alexandropol-Kars Railway, 1899, Alexandropol-Yerevan Railway, 1902, Yerevan-Julfa to Iran Railway, 1908. All of this must have facilitated the integration of Yerevan with the rest of the Caucasus. It must have had a major effect on the socio-economic conditions of the Yerevan province and on the cities of Yerevan and Alexandropol, Gyumri in particular. I was also curious to find the answer to the following questions. What was the administrative structure and economic condition of this province in the last years of imperial rule? How did the First Armenian Republic manage to administrate the day-to-day life between May 1918 and December 1920? How, despite epidemics, lack of food, enemy attacks, inundated with over 300,000 refugees, was the government of the First Republic run by a small group of good-intentioned Armenian ARF leaders, so don't get upset, from Tiflis, was able to function? How did they function? They came from Tiflis, 9 of them, barely. How did the Armenian Republic, in less than its 1,000 days of its existence, seemed to suddenly create the educational institutions, the courts, the prisons, post-telegraph, transportation, army, medical veterinary center, the police, agricultural, irrigation, administrative structure that maintained it? This bothered me. I was lucky. During my recent research trips to St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, I was fortunate to find a complete set in Russian of the official imperial almanacs and statistical information printed by the government of this province in Russian on the social and economic conditions for the years 1900 to 1914. That's why you see that book. The reports contain the names of all the 1,295 villages, every village in these areas. And I have the maps in the book, the 11 maps. Okay? The number of Armenians in each village, the number of Turco-Tatars, they are later Azeris. Russians, Azeri is a new term. Okay, it started in 1918. Don't be fooled, there was no such country. So, they even didn't have an alphabet, they used Persian. Now they've suddenly become Azeris. Kurds, including the Yazidis, Assyrians, and Russians, both male and female, in each town and in each village. Who owned the property, the taxes paid by each community, the number of animals in each village, big animals and small animals, the type of farms and pastures, the type of agricultural products, exports, imports, the names and ethnicity of the main administrators, police chiefs, doctors, court and prison officials, veterinarians, architects, district supervisors, irrigation supervisors, as well as the various train stations, the price of train tickets, the post telegraph offices, the cost of mailing a letter. So all of this nonsense, of course, it's not easy reading. The book, by the way, is very expensive. Don't buy it. If you're not going to read it, it won't make a difference to me. I won't be upset. Okay? I'm not like those professors that bring books and force you to buy them. Okay? Don't buy them. But it's available in the library. Get it from the library. My new monograph, the Yerevan province from 1900 to 1914, which you have, includes all this information, a little of which I'll share with you today. Now, the governor and the vice governor of the Yerevan province obviously were Russian. They were both, however, assisted by numerous Armenian advisors and functionaries that included Armenian registrars, archivists, land surveyors, city engineers, statisticians, bookkeepers, men in charge of the official provincial printing press, fire department, courts, tax, I can go on and on. For example, Samson Tersahakian was the senior advisor to the vice governor. His assistant was Hovakim Hassan Jalalian. The department in charge of land tenure was administered by Levon Hassan Jalalian, who was assisted by Simbat Terghazarian. The city architect was Armenian Bogos Keshishian, who supervised a number of Armenian, Georgian, and Russian technicians and craftsmen. The chief medical officer, that's for you, of the province was an Armenian named Zarmair Astvaturovich. They have the Russian. Andreasyan, who directed Russian and Armenian-speaking European health officials, all Russian-speaking. The chief veterinarian of the province was an Armenian called Vartan Torosians. He and his assistant, Michael Mikhaelian, supervised a staff composed of Armenians and very few Russians. Thanks to the efforts of the 23 veterinary centers, the number of livestock in the province had increased. And I have in the book, every year, the number of cows, donkeys, etc., 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 had increased considerably. Many of the local vets were Russian, local, but Armenian and a handful of Georgian and European vets worked in these centers. Yerevan had a slaughterhouse with Russian and Armenian doctors inspecting the animals and inspecting the meat. The city of Yerevan had a hospital whose director and the entire staff, save for only one person, were Armenian. 2 doctors, Terhovanesyan and Teravetisyan, were in charge of the hospital. There were very few Russian, but many Armenian midwives in the main towns and villages. There were no Muslims in either profession. Yerevan also had an insane asylum, and there were prisons in both Yerevan and Alexandropol, vaccinations for smallpox, improved sanitary conditions, had reduced cholera, malaria, and scarlet fever epidemics, and the mortality rate, we have the mortality rate for the entire 14 years, going down. The mayor of Yerevan was an Armenian named Ivan Karapetovich Melik Agamalyan. He belonged to the same Melik Agamalyan family that was responsible for the Armenians of the city during the rule of the last Persian Khan and Sardar Hossein Qoli Khan Qajar. The mayor's office was composed primarily of Armenians with professional degrees from noted families. I'm not going to read all the families, just a few. Hassan Jalalian, Melik Bunyatov, Mehrabian, Ayvazian. They're all there. You may find your family among them. Okay? Many of them have added the OV to their name. So it's Ov, Khachaturov. But that continued in the Soviet period too. The mayor of Alexandropol, which was the largest city of the province, not Yerevan, Gyumri was the largest, was also an Armenian, Hovsep Tigranian. Since the city had an overwhelming Armenian majority, the council was composed only of Armenians. The mayor of Novobayazit, Stepan Bakityats, as well as the entire city council, were Armenian. Even in the districts with Muslim majorities, the Armenians had members in the council. All the police prefectures, by the way, these numbers you see are the police prefectures. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is where the police stations or the police prefects were. Okay? All the police prefectures were located in Armenian villages. The police chief of Yerevan was an Armenian, Constantin Arakelian. The police superintendent of Davalu, Armenian, Melik Yeganyan. Police chief of Alexandropol, Alexander Markaryan, assisted by another Armenian. Armenians and Russians were solely in charge of train stations, post-telegraph systems. By 1908, the Yerevan province had postal and telegraph connections with Russia via Tiflis, with Persia via Julfa and Urdubad, with the Ottoman Empire via Alexandropol and Kars. The cities of the province, that is Yerevan, Alexandropol, Nakhchivan, Novobayazid, etc., as well as the major towns, all had central telegraph post office. The official data for the year 1910 records 311 educational institutions, lower level, upper level, all the way to the gymnasium level. Gymnasium is a Russian term copied from the German. It's almost like getting a AA degree, 2 years of college, high school and 2 years of college, with a total of 23,530 students, 18,097 males, 5,433 females. There were no Muslims among the females. So there were 5,000 Armenian ladies studying, which already shows the overwhelming majority of these 23,000 students, over 90% were Armenian. The Armenians of the Yerevan province took advantage of upper-level state schools. In addition to Armenian, they learned Russian, sometimes German and French, and therefore, unlike the Muslims, were able to continue their professional education outside the province, as well as to obtain posts in the provincial administration. Okay? Records show that very few Muslims could write or speak Russian. I mean, if you remember, Khachatur Abovian finished, he went to University of Dorpat, which is present-day Baltic states, and got his degree in Dorpat. People would finish Yerevan, go to the academy in Tiflis, from there to a Russian school or a European school. Tsarist military sources agree that after the Turkmenchai Treaty with Iran, Russia did not anticipate any danger from Iran in any future conflicts. Therefore, out of the 5 military barracks in this province, only one was located in Nakhchivan, close to Iran. The other 4, most of them were in this area and this area next to Turkey. Echmiadzin, etc., mostly, and in Alexandropol. Tax records of the province clearly indicate that most Muslim men were exempt from military service. Russians didn't trust them in this area. In exchange, they had to pay a special army tax. Armenians, however, were recruited and trained. The Armenian draftees learned the necessary military skills which enabled them to fight off the Turks in 1918. When you talk about the Battle of Sardarabad, etc., etc., but these people came where? From the sky somehow? They were there. Armenian businessmen dominated Yerevan. Their cognac, wines, cognac is not new, their cognac, wines, and canned goods sold all over Russia. They even placed advertisements, and I found all the advertisements in journals and newspapers in Russian. Georg Khachaturov, who owned the Orient Hotel, notified the newspaper that his establishment was a first-class hotel with rooms starting at 1 ruble 20 kopecks a night. I wish that was true again. The hotel had a superb restaurant in the garden with an orchestra. The Ohanyan factory, which produced canned apricots and crushed tomatoes, boasted that its products were sold in the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. An Armenian named Tatebosyan advertised his shop specializing in imported porcelain, crystal, and furniture. The brewing beer company, Zanga, which was owned by the Armenian Avedissians, advertised its beer. Harutunian factory hawked its tin and metal products. Tatevos brothers advertised their sausage factory and store in Yerevan. A large store owned by Gabrielians and Son sold weapons and samovars made at the imperial factory in Tula. Armenian barbers, hairdressers, florists, haberdashers proclaimed their shops and services. Armenian-owned bookstores, music stores, pharmacies, this is all Armenian, perfumeries, all claimed to have the latest European and Russian products. The Apollo Theater, the only theater in Yerevan, owned by an Armenian, even had the latest silent films accompanied by an orchestra. Okay, it's very interesting. Most of you don't realize this. Suddenly it appears, okay? By 1914, therefore, Russian Armenia, which had started as a peasant backwater of the empire, was on the verge of being transformed. Now, it's true that Yerevan Alexandropol could not compete with the cultural brilliance of Tiflis, with its operas, electricity and all that, and the industrial output of Baku. But the territory of this province, after more than 3 centuries of war, had profited from the security provided by the imperial umbrella and had benefited from the reforms initiated by the viceroys of the Caucasus. The same thing happened you may not like the Soviet system, but 70 years of Soviet rule gave Armenia security.
And an infrastructure.
Yeah, well, that will come, definitely. Okay? So, the linguistic, manufacturing, and commercial skills of the Armenian inhabitants enabled them to advance far more than their Muslim counterparts. And they dominated manufacturing, administration, and professions. It's all in the book, their names, lists. It is clear that on the eve of the World War, First World War, Russian Armenia was staffed by a relatively small group of Russian officials, with Armenians employed in all positions, even in some of the higher ones. Unlike the Muslims, Turks and Kurds, the Armenians had embraced the Russian presence in the Caucasus. And as one scholar has pointed out, they had tried to lessen their outsider status within the imperial system. Of course, remember, there were problems that I address in the book. In 1903, if you remember, the governor Golitsyn confiscated the Armenian church property. Frimian Hayrik fought against it. It was not always paradise, but it had changed Armenia very well. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, many of the high-ranking Russian officials, the few that were there, left. Their Armenian assistants, the one I mentioned, filled the vacant post. The data is conclusive. The Armenian Republic, which replaced this, was not created in a vacuum. It did not emerge fully formed like the goddess Athena from the head of Zeus. Okay? Didn't happen like that. Since many of the Armenian political and literary figures resided in Tiflis, it was in that city and not Yerevan that the Armenian National Congress, dominated by the ARF, formed the political core. Following the Bolshevik Revolution and the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Turkish front and the Turkish invasion and occupation. Oh, what happened? I made a mistake. It went, well, the Turks occupied this. Half of Alexandropol, a large part of Echmiadzin, a little bit, half of Armenia was occupied by the Turks. Okay? The ANC, Armenian National Council in Tiflis, against the advice of Aram Manukyan and the Armenian defenders, who had managed to stop, we don't know how well it would have happened at the end, Turkish advance at Sardarabad, Karakilis, and Bashaparan, and were marching on Alexandropol, the ANC felt that he had no choice but to make peace with the Turks. On May 28, some say May 29, some say May 30, it doesn't matter, they announced the formation of the independent Armenian Republic. And on June 4th, they signed the Batum Treaty, which left Armenia with half its territory. Half of what you see there disappeared. since the Turks had occupied the Yerevan half of, including all the train, all the railroad, and the other half was full of refugees suffering from typhus, cholera, hunger, I don't have to tell you, you know. Many of the ANC leaders, some of whom had lived very well in Tiflis, naively planned to govern Armenia from Tiflis, which was impossible because Tiflis had become the capital of the Georgian Republic, which had declared security under the German flag. So they were soon driven out. If you read Hovhanessian's book, you should see with what humiliating way the ANC was driven out of Tiflis. They were sitting on the platform for some time. No Georgian official came to say goodbye to them. They had no train. The Turks had to provide the train. The Turkish colonel provided the train for the Armenian government to come to Yerevan. I mean, you know, we have to realize this is a major problem. They arrived in Yerevan only on July 17. Their arrival caused resentment on part of some of the local Armenians because they had fought the Turks, they had run the government, and suddenly these Johnny-come-latelys come from Tiflis trying to run the government. On August the 1st, 1918, the Armenian legislative body, the Khorur, met for the first time to govern a land on the verge of death. The provincial hospitals, the former officials I mentioned, did their best to relieve the sufferings that the government endured during the last months of World War I. It's not the fault of the Armenians from Tiflis. They had to rely on the local Armenian commanders, troops, doctors, veterinarians, midwives, nurses, teachers, architects, engineers, skilled craftsmen, etc. The defeat of the Central Powers in November 1918, which took Turkey out of World War I, also meant finally the Turks left. Armenia was liberated, of course in very bad shape. And for the next year and a half, they tried their best to survive. This is not the lecture today, that's another lecture. They did some things right, some things wrong. It doesn't matter. Every government does that. Meanwhile, the Turkish Grand National Assembly, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Ankara, rejected the Sevr Treaty, as you know, and prepared to prevent the breakup of Turkey. Treaty of Sevr would have broken Turkey up. I mean, I'm not saying I wish it had happened, but it didn't happen. By the summer of 1920, the Anglo-French interests in the Arab Middle East abandoned Armenia. The refusal of the United States Senate to accept Wilson's mandate for Armenia left Armenia alone at the mercy of both the Turkish nationalists and the Bolsheviks. In the end, the Republic could not withstand the combined invasions by both the Turkish and Red armies. And on December 2nd, 1920, it was transformed into the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. Upon entering Armenia, the zealous Armenian and non-Armenian Bolsheviks embarked on what some historians call war communism. They arrested Armenian leaders, requisitioned livestock, foodstuffs, farm equipment, and even household wares. Okay? They started spreading atheism, abortion on demand, equal rights for women, the right to divorce. Women could have a right to divorce, which is exactly what they did in Russia. These actions did not make them popular. Taking advantage that the Red Army had moved to Sovietize Georgia, the Armenians on February 18, 1921, rose against the Bolsheviks, drove them out of Yerevan into Sharur and Lake Sevan area. And they created a government. The Salvation Committee of the Fatherland under Simon Varatsian assumed control of the government. On April 2nd, 1921, the Red Army, after taking Georgia, returns to Armenia. The Salvation Committee and many thousands of fighters, civilians, fled to Daralagöz and Zangezur and created the government of Lerna Hayastan for a short time. It was at this junction that Lenin harshly criticized the Armenian Bolsheviks and assigned a new group of moderate Armenian Bolsheviks headed by Alexander Myasnikian. Myasnikian not only offered a general amnesty, but also promised that Zangezur would be permanently incorporated into Soviet Armenia. It was at this junction that most of the leaders of Lerna Hayastan, among them, of course, the Dashnak leadership, crossed the Araks into Iran on July 16, 1921. A few months later, by the Treaty of Kars, October 13, 1921, Turkey, Bolshevik Russia, Soviet Armenia, Soviet Azerbaijan, and Soviet Georgia, together with the Turks, okay, signed the Treaty of Kars. And by that treaty, this is what happened. This area, Surmalu, which had a very small Armenian population, I know Mount Ararat is there, but you have to realize that when you read this book and you look at the statistical numbers of this district, there were 7 districts. Armenians were, very few Armenians lived around Mount Ararat. Mostly Kurdish nomads. By the way, to this day, I've driven there, they're still Kurdish nomads. It's not a place that you can plant a lot. Armenians are city people, or at least they need better land. This is a very cold area, except for the city of Igdir, which had the salt mines, Tuzluca in Turkey today. Okay, so that's where the word Tuz comes from, salt. So this the Turks annexed, because the Araks River comes this way. So the Araks River, whatever was below the Araks River, the Turks took. This area, which had a Muslim majority, was the Soviets decided to give it to Azerbaijan. However, in the middle is Zangezur. So this became a kind of an autonomous area connected to Azerbaijan, but separated. During the Soviet time, there was no problem. The train used to go straight. There was a train from Yerevan to Baku, and it would go straight by the Araks River. I've taken that train. You could see the Araks going all the way. Okay, no problem. But unfortunately, we lost this. Although not many Armenians comparatively were there. Right? Soviet Union and Turkey served as a guarantor of Nakhchivan's status. In 1934, Iran, which controlled half of Small Ararat, that you don't know. Small Ararat is right here. The line went from the top of the head of Small Ararat. Half of it was in Iran, half of it was in Turkey. In 1934, the father of the last Shah, Reza Shah, went to Turkey. He met Ankara, he met Ataturk, and after that, Iran exchanged land. It gave this half to the Turks for some villages at the border of Iraq and Iran. I have an article on that printed somewhere else, it doesn't matter. The exchange allowed Turkey to have a better land route to Nakhchivan. Today there are two bridges going, there is an opening here going to Nakhchivan. European Highway M, I forgot, it's in the book, M something, it goes there. So, between 1939 and 45, the Soviet Stalin tried to annul the treaty to take something back from the Turks, Kars, Ardahan, etc. But he wasn't going to give it to the Armenians, I'm sorry. Okay? It was nothing to do with the Armenians. Don't think he woke up in the morning and suddenly became pro-Armenian. Although the largely populated Armenian areas of Akhalkalak, Javakh, and Shushi remained outside this new Soviet Armenian Republic, Soviet Armenia ended up with 4 solid Armenian districts. That is Yerevan, Nakhchivan, Novobayazid, Echmiadzin, as well as Armenian populated districts which did not belong to them originally. The territory of Zangezur, and here, oh, that's the map, sorry. It's, yeah. Armenia got D. These two areas were not Zangezur and what is today Lori Tavush area. Okay? Dilijan, which you like so much, was not part of the Yerevan province. Neither was Alaverdi with the copper mines. That is the D. Armenia got these two. They lost B, they lost A, but they gained it. And I have calculated it. Okay? I've calculated the square mileage. Soviet Armenia, with 11,505.84 square miles, ended up being 233.26 square miles larger than the Yerevan province. Now you say, well, but you're forgetting Kars, you're forgetting this. Yes. But the last time Kars was in part of historic Armenia was 1064. Then for a short time, the Russians had taken it over. They were not planning to give it to Armenia. It was a Kars province, mostly Greeks. Armenians were there too, many Armenians, but there were Greeks, Russians, and others living there. The detachment of the largely Muslim areas, A and B, as well as transfer of whatever Armenians were left here, they all went back to to Soviet Armenia. Painful as it was, I'm not saying it's a picnic, painful as it was for the Armenians, assured a solid Armenian majority in the new republic. The Soviet Armenian Republic, with all these border modifications, became the heir to the Armenian province, Yerevan province, and the First Armenian Republic. And then, according to the first official Soviet census, 1926, Armenians formed 84.4% in 1926 already of the population of Soviet Armenians. There were only 8.8% Muslims remained in Soviet Armenia. The city of Yerevan, which had a population of some 30,000 in 1914, became 64,649 in 26, 204,214 in 39. 20 years later, it reached over 500,000. These are official statistics, Soviet Armenia. 1970 census, 767,000 and change. Between 1972-79, population grew from 817 to over 1 million something. And by 1989, the last year of normalcy. I know the Soviet Armenia collapsed in 1991, but 1989 is when it was the heyday. After that, it started all sorts of problems. It reached 1,200,000 residents. By the end of Soviet rule, Armenia, with a population of over 3.3 million, became the second most densely populated republic after Moldova. The Armenians made up 94% of the population of the republic. Armenia became the only republic in the Soviet Union that had almost a total homogeneous population. By the end of Soviet rule, Armenia had achieved a national cohesion unparalleled in its modern history. Modern history is 500 years. Okay? In addition, the literacy rate among the Armenians were one of the highest in the Soviet Union. These are Soviet statistics. I'm not making this up. Armenians, together with the Jews, earned the most advanced degrees per capita. Okay? Unfortunately, many Armenians, just as they had done during the imperial era, continued to live in Tiflis, Baku, and immigrated to other cities of the Soviet Union. This has been a problem. It was a problem when the Republic started, and now it's going to be the problem when Soviet Armenia collapsed. Because you know what happened to the Armenians in Baku, and what the Armenians in Tiflis are not doing very well, or that they are not being killed, but they are kind of I was just there in March. I can tell you it's not that, it's no honeymoon. One cannot predict the future of Yerevan province would have been had there been no Russian Revolution. On one hand, the Yerevan province had benefited from the security provided by the empire. Her educated men and women had acquired the necessary administrative skills by working within the Russian administrative apparatus. In the absence of revolution and war, the Yerevan province may have, in time, been able to shed more of its agrarian character. The city of Yerevan may have become a major urban center. On the other hand, there is a strong probability that the national awakening of the large Muslim population would eventually cause problems for the Armenians living in Surmalu, Sharur, and Nakhchivan. Moreover, the imperial structure would continue to favor Tiflis and Baku. And once again, most talented Armenians would have remained there or moved there for their educational and economic benefits. Furthermore, one cannot speculate the future of the Armenian Republic had it remained outside Soviet, so let's assume it remained. The odds that the newly formed Armenian Republic, with its large Armenian population, remember that still was there, surrounded by hostile neighbors, mired by refugees, hunger, epidemics, lacking important natural resources and Western aid, could have developed into a viable state. Maybe, maybe not. I'm almost done. Following Sovietization, the leaders in Moscow consciously encouraged the policy of nation building in the three southern republics. This was especially true in Azerbaijan, whose Iranian heritage had to be erased. A new alphabet was given to them, and they gave them a new national identity. They have forgotten, by the way, that this is new. Nation-building efforts were made in Armenia as well. The new orthography, you know, the yans and the ayans and the orthography, the limiting of Western Armenian speech and literature, the making of patriotic films, the publication of scholarly works in Armenian. Most of that before was published in Tiflis. The erection of statues of approved national heroes, various literary and artistic activities focusing on Eastern Armenian, and the changing of place name. 1,295 villages, most of them had Muslim, Turkish, Arabic names. They had to be changed them into Armenian names. That drove me crazy. I had to find these 1,200 goddamn things, go for look at the old name and find the new names, because they've changed. It completed the transformation. Soviet rule for the first time transformed Armenia from a primarily agricultural land into an urban and industrial society. Factories producing chemicals, synthetic rubber, textiles, machinery, processed foods, electronic products appeared all over Armenia. Lacking large rivers for hydroelectric plants, the government constructed the nuclear plant, which you know, which not only supplied the electricity for Armenia, but also enabled it to send it to the neighboring republics. However, as Armenian industrial output increased and even surpassed its neighboring republic, the pollution and the damage to the environment rose considerably. You recently have gone, you can see Mount Ararat. The first time I went in 1968, all the way to 1980s, Mount Ararat was shrouded behind a brown veil of smog. You could rarely see it from Yerevan. Cancer rates increased. Every major river in Armenia was declared ecologically damaged. And poorly planned irrigation project resulted in the lowering of Lake Sevan's water level. This is in those days. Despite the many defects, now I'm not saying one is better than the other, be very careful. Despite the many defects of communist rule, especially during the Stalin era, Soviet Armenia took giant strides during its 70 years. As you said, the architectural structure of modern Yerevan, the Academy of Sciences, the expansion of institutions of higher education, the famed Observatory of Burakan, the opera, theater, ballet, Armenfield, conservatory, philharmonic, Matenadaran archives, modern airport, sports stadiums, hotels, museum, tourism, contacts with the Armenians, all with the diaspora, all of that was accomplished. You may not like it, but it's a fact. Soviet Armenian leaders even managed to erect monuments to the Sardarabad victory and the monument commemorating the Armenian genocide. This was all done then. Okay? Now, there were problems. Of course there were problems. But one thing you have to remember that most of the Soviet Armenian leaders were Armenian first, communist second. Especially Demirjan, the last one. If you go to Yerevan today, and I've been to Yerevan many, ask a regular person who is making very little money, is your life better now or better then? You'll get the answer. The collapse of the Soviet Union left Armenia once again alone, surrounded by larger hostile neighbors except for Iran, without any major natural resources. The new independent republic, however, had a number of assets that its two predecessors lacked. A strong national identity, a local political leadership, you may not good or bad, at least there was a leadership, a large cadre of highly educated professionals, a better trained military, and a powerful diaspora. It enabled the new republic to overcome the difficult early years of independence and even to take Artsakh back. Okay? Ironically, several years later, political and economic realities has placed Armenia once again under the protection of Russia. We're going through the same thing. The 20-year agreement, military agreement with Russia, etc., etc., etc. 40, sorry, you're right. The 20-year era, the 20-year era dominated by Kochari and Sarkisian governments. Well, we don't have to go into that, was a problem, and it caused more immigration to the US, Russia, and Europe. The new government of Armenia has begun an era of hope and has promised major changes. What the future will hold for Armenia remains to be seen. In conclusion, I believe that a serious historian has to state the facts without political agenda or the fear that it may challenge existing national mythology or sentiment. Thank you.